Let's open in prayer. If you'll join me, we'll go ahead and begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord,
and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me.
Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. You have 3 objectives today. They are differently numbered than in your notes, so sorry about that. Number 17, which is your number 18, you should be able to identify the legal and material constraints on slaves' lives and work. Number 18, which is your 19, you should be able to explain how distinct slave cultures emerged in the Old South. And number 19, which is your 20, you should be able to describe the major forms of resistance to slavery. So in this section of the textbook, from starting right about now through what we do in Christmas, is actually, I think, for my money, the best written, most compelling section out of your textbook. It's Dr. Foner's main field of study is the Civil War, and so I think when you're reading it, I think you're coming up some of the most gripping parts of the book. So enjoy it. Go ahead and enjoy your textbook for the next handful of chapters. I know that's a weird thing to say, but I do think it's great, and I think it's let yourself enjoy it besides just making your reading marks. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 18. And I want to talk a little bit about how slave culture kind of develops and slave-owning culture kind of develops. So let's begin and say that slaves were considered property, and slaves had very few legal rights. It is not a very good analog to compare slaves to animals, because we're talking about human beings. But it's the best comparison I can kind of think of today, that animals don't have rights, but there are some legal protections about mistreatment of animals, right? So it's for example, slaves don't have rights, but there are some, I don't want to say protections, but some ways that people can operate. The slaves were not allowed to testify against a white person. So a slave, if called into court, cannot testify against a white person. They can't carry a firearm. Essentially being property, slaves can't leave the plantation without permission. I think in every state there were prohibitions against teaching slaves to read or write. Illiteracy was seen as one of the protections of the slave system, that if slaves don't know how to read and write, they can't organize to challenge the system or gather in a group without white people there to monitor it. Slave masters controlled whether or not slaves married and how they spent their free time. And how they spent their free time. So there were slaves that would get married, but slave marriages were not stable, and it would be very possible for a married couple, a husband and wife, to be split up and sold separately. So there's, marriage is usually a bond till the end, but in slave life, they just can't make that promise. The whole system of maintaining order rested on force, and there was a lot of tools that a master might keep to use to keep order. Whipping, exploiting social divisions among slaves, creating incentives, or the threat of sale. And the threat of sale was real and perpetual and pretty tough. If somebody was sold, then you've literally been uprooted from the life you know and sent off to some other place. So sale was a pretty serious threat. Conditions of slave life. Now, in the United States, slave life looked a little different than some of the rest of the world. So compared to their counterparts in the Caribbean and the West Indies and Brazil was known as being a particularly tough slave-owning country. American slaves enjoyed better diets, lower infant mortality, and longer life expectancies. There's a couple of reasons for this. On one sense, that just climactically, it's easier in North America than it is in the Caribbean and Brazil, where the tougher weather makes it more prone to disease. But any of these improvements that would happen in the United States, a lot of it ended up justifying the practice. American slave owners could say like, well, I'm a good slave owner. My slaves are well fed and taken care of and they're healthy. As if there's a way to say that somebody is like a good slave owner, right? I mean, the whole thing denies the humanity of the person, but there were ways that people would justify it to themselves. Subpoint C, there were also free African Americans, and in the South, where most of them were. By 1860, which is strictly speaking not in period 4, but phoners teaching history, not the AP course, by 1860, there was nearly 500,000 free black people in the United States, and mostly in the South. But it's worth noting that free black people were not necessarily all that free. They were allowed to own property, and they were allowed to marry, and could have greater stability being a free person for both of those. Although sometimes it's worth noting, allowed to own property does not mean actually can, because property is expensive, and you're talking about the people on the lowest part of the economic scale here. Free black people had no voice in selecting public officials. There was no vote, and could not testify in court or serve on a jury. We're not really talking about citizenship here. We're talking about existence, I suppose. That there are free black people, but they are definitely not equals. Now in the South, the biggest cities in the South, in particular New Orleans and Charleston, the South doesn't have a lot of cities. It's not a very urban part of the world. But the biggest cities that exist would include like New Orleans, Charleston. They're relatively prosperous, free black communities developed there. The majority of free black people lived in the Upper South, though. New Orleans, Charleston might have had free black communities, but the majority of free black people lived in the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, and there worked as farmhands or laborers, and almost entirely in rural areas. So, but slave labor, let's focus again on slavery. Labor was most of what a slave did for their waking hours, whether as a butler or a cook, domestic servants, nurse, waitress, coachman, maybe some skilled work and some artisans, carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, but most slaves worked in the fields. Most slaves were agricultural field hands. 75% of women and probably 90% of men were field hands. This is a photo up here on the screen, an undated photograph, which means we have entered the era of photography. It's early photography, but it exists, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth for a couple of more units between artistry and photography to depict the pictures, but welcome to the world of photography. On large plantations, slaves worked in slave gangs under the direction of an overseer. Yes, Harry?
So when they took pictures, didn't people have to stand still for like a really long time?
It depends on how much light would be exposed in it. So out of doors, under sunlight, usually not.
Okay.
But clouder conditions, you got to leave the shutter open longer to expose the film to light. Good question. On large plantations, slaves worked in groups, gangs under the direction of an overseer. The overseer almost always was a man and basically always had the reputation of being a cruel master. Had a real reputation of cruelty and rough treatment. Now there's one change in South Carolina and Georgia in rice country. Cotton is mostly replacing all of the other crops, but a couple of places rice is just still climactically the thing to grow. South Carolina and Georgia. There the system is a little different. It almost harkens back to the colonial era, the idea of the task system, where somebody would be given a to-do list, and once they fill the to-do list, they could kind of peace out on their day and just return back. And that's because rice is grown in swampy conditions, and a lot of masters and overseers don't want to go into it. There's the risk of mosquitoes and malaria that would come out of it. So there's some of the rice country ends up having a task system rather than an overseer system. There's also urban slavery, and this is not a huge amount, but it's worth mentioning. Around 1/5 slaves worked in factories in the Upper South, where there is industry, ironworks and tobacco factories. City slaves tended to be domestic servants, cooks, maids, stuff like that. There were a few, and certainly not many, but it's interesting when it shows up. A few city slaves actually were skilled artisans, and sometimes even had the autonomy of living on their own. They don't have freedom, they're a slave, but they sometimes even had a little bit of just like personal freedom of having their own apartment or place to live. That really doesn't represent most of urban slavery, but it's interesting when it pops up. Roman numeral 19. In terms of just slave life, slaves never abandoned the culture for freedom or determination to resist their bondage. Kind of a classic phonerism right here. There's always the hope for freedom. But within that hope, you see that a slave culture develops. Now, a lot of people did marry and create families, but again, marriage is an unstable thing when a person doesn't control their own life. In an effort to try to create some lineage in a world that doesn't let you do that, names become very important. Family names retaining family continuity is kind of the only way to hold together a world that's, people can't hold it together on their own. The slave community had a significantly higher number of women-headed households as compared to the white community, and I think that again speaks to the instability of family life of slavery. In some states, as many as 1 in 3 slave marriages were broken up by sale. Children separated from families, just because children belong to a family doesn't mean that they have that right. Sale can break that up pretty easily, and slave traders put very little attention into maintaining family ties. Yes?
So like in Roots, they showed Kunta Kinte being given a different name.
Mhm.
Did like slave traders do that commonly, or?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty normal thing. Subpoint B. In terms of Christianity, black Christianity was very distinctive. Of the religions, so like America by this point is no longer importing slaves. There's an importation agreement against slaves coming into the country. So basically all slaves are domestic, homegrown. That's a bad way to say that, but like raised in America, not imported in. So and so Christianity really pretty much replaces any African religions. And black Christianity was very distinctive. It was hope-based. Almost every plantation, so any collection of slaves of any size, the collection of size, not the people of size, had their own black preacher. Slaves would worship in biracial churches. Now please note, this is not an integrated church. Integration implies some level of equality. This is biracial, which means that there are white and black people together in the building, but it's not an assumption of equality. Now, free black people have a little more of an option. Free black people could establish their own churches. A lot of masters would require that if their slaves are going to go to church, and they were required to go to church, they would go to churches with white ministers, and the large emphasis is on obedience. Now, of course, obedience is a Christian virtue, but we're not talking about Christian obedience, we're talking about lowercase o obedience. But there's always a sense that Christianity is the interpretation, like, you look at Christianity through the eyes of a slave. We all approach our Lord on the path that He's given us, right? So the Exodus, the idea, I see it. The Exodus played a central role in black Christianity. While Jesus Christ is a personal redeemer for all of us, that's good theology. It was very, very important in slave culture to represent the redemption, the buying out of the slavery. And it seemed like the Christian message of brotherhood was an indictment of slavery, and I think this is a pretty easy case to make. You take St. Paul's letters, where he says there is no Jew or Greek or slave or free. I think that carries the Christianity itself an indictment of slavery, but some people play up or play down that part. Yes, Harry.
So because like a lot of the slaves at this time were like born in the U.S., was there like a significant amount that like thought that the way things were the way that they were like supposed to be, like they accepted that like they were supposed to be a slave?
I think there's an inevitability of it. Like this is just the way it is. I don't know that there's ever really an acceptance of it.
Okay.
I mean, even little kids don't like it when their parents put them to bed. They feel like it's deeply unjust that bedtime is at 8 o'clock. I mean, I think it's just like innate to our being. But I think there is a sense of inevitability about it. Subpoint C, slave folklore glorified the weak over the strong. There used to be, I'm finding year after year that fewer and fewer people know these stories of like Brer Rabbit. Brer Rabbit, the great African American folk tale about like the wily rabbit who's always using his cunning and skill to outfox his enemies. There was even a Disney cartoon, The Song of the South.
It was so bad.
And yeah, today it's got a lot of racial baggage with it. I don't think it was meant to be racist, but it certainly carries a lot of baggage with it. Yeah, Disney has stopped its sale. I've wanted to find a copy of this for years.
Look on YouTube.
No?
I found one on YouTube. Like
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, can I check?
No.
Song of the South. The one with the racist movie.
I don't think it was intended to be, but it certainly was
but,
animated
like,
that way.
it comes off.
But the idea of like the Brer Rabbit, the wily rabbit who's always outfoxing the fox, and when he gets captured, he says, "Oh, don't throw me into the briar patch. That sounds terrible. Anything but the briar patch." So the fox like throws him in the briar patch, and he's like, "No, I'm Brer Rabbit. I grew up in the briars, and you just thrown me back where I'm safe from you because you can't come get me." Now, it's always like he's like outfoxing the enemy, and this meant a lot in slave culture, where you felt like you had to kind of outfox your oppressors. So slave folklore glorifies the weak over the strong. The music that arises that we know it today as the Negro spirituals, like emphasizing liberation and freedom to it. All slaves basically see the injustice of slavery, and they really, there's some like great speeches talking about like how can Americans celebrate the 4th of July yet own slaves? You know, preach freedom and yet deny it. While there is prohibitions against literacy, against reading and writing, and the prohibitions are designed to keep people a little bit confused about what's happening outside the plantation, human networks also develop where people talk to people. And human networking know about the political events and even the activities of abolitionists. Yes, you may. Roman numeral number 20. Slaves are outnumbered. By far, they're outnumbered. There's not, it's not even close. So slave rebellions become rare. When they happen, they are notable, but any significant size of a slave rebellion is rare. And it makes sense that it's rare because they're outnumbered. But there was other forms of resistance that was widely practiced. Probably the most frequent was just sabotage. Master tells you to dig a ditch, you break all the shovels. Sorry, can't dig the ditch, all the shovels are broken. Just a little bit of sabotage. Or abusing animals. Well, a horse can't pull a wagon because the horse has a broken leg. You know, there's a sense that like this is a way of sticking it to the man. Somebody wake up Shank. Okay.
Sorry.
Accept your apology. Okay. More threatening to the. Oh, there were some cases that like slaves would just outright poison their masters, burn the house down. That was not very common, but it did happen that you get like some pretty severe sabotage. More threatening to the whole system was the threat of running away. It's a far greater threat to the whole system of slavery. Just the slaves would be gone, and a person loses their investment in the slaves. So you see in the North, the upper South, the Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, you see escape is pretty common, and it makes sense that escape is common there. It's easy to get into free states. In the deeper South, the method of slavery escaping was to just disappear into the cities. Because there are free black communities in places like New Orleans and Charleston, a slave who can make it to the city might be able to just blend in and pass off as a free person. Yes?
Why are there more free blacks in the South than the North?
I think it has to relate to overall number of African Americans in the South. There's just not that many in the North. Yeah. I mean, all the ones in the North are free, but just the bigger population is in the South. That's not true. There are slaves in the North, as the grandfathered ones were being phased out. There were actually Northern slaves all the way up until the Civil War. Yeah.
because of the fugitive slave clause, why did a lot of the slaves like stop just once they got out of Kentucky, Virginia, or Maryland?
Because it's just hard to keep going, I guess. I don't know. I mean, the farther north you go, the fewer African Americans there are up there. So it makes it harder to blend in or to disappear or to have autonomy or even just have people around. Yeah. The network to lead slaves out, of course, is the Great Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, a loose organization of abolitionists. It was not, like a railroad in real life is highly organized. The Underground Railroad was not. It was a loose, cooperative kind of thing. And there were people known as the conductors who could go and help slaves escape. The most famous of which is Harriet Tubman, who, she herself an escaped slave who led around 20 incursions into the South to go free other people. Tubman's work is really heroic. I mean, she herself is an escaped slave, so she is a fugitive and a wanted woman, yet she's going back into enemy territory to go help other people escape. She would be wanted, one, as herself as an escaped slave, but two, as an accomplice towards others. Tubman's work is heroic. There was some discussion a few years ago that Andrew Jackson of the $20 bill would be replaced by Tubman. It appears this effort is kind of stalled. Nobody's giving a straight answer as to why. The Treasury has, even mocked up bills for it. I think the shortest answer, and this is a real answer, this doesn't, some people think this sounds like an insult. It's not. Donald Trump just likes Andrew Jackson. He's a populist. Trump's a populist. There's a lot to admire about Jackson. So I think that's kind of what it is. During his time, he doesn't want to replace his favorite president with Tubman. But there was some discussion, and I think probably in the future she would make it to the 20 over Jackson. Yes.
Is there any reason why it was Andrew Jackson particularly?
Jackson was just sometimes been a very, very popular president.
Okay.
He's a transformative guy. He really did rewrite how the government operated. He's one of the greats, whether or not you like him or not. You recognize him as one of the major figures in the presidency. Subpoint B, I want to talk about a couple of rebellions. The first one we're going to talk about is led by a guy named Denmark Vesey. Now, Denmark is his first name, and I think rebellion might be a strange term to use here. Denmark Vesey, in 1822, lived in Charleston. He's a free black man, so he's not a slave, he's a free man. And Denmark Vesey was an agitator. He loved to go and needle people, particular white people, about the nature of slavery. Now, he had been antagonizing white people, calling out the hypocrisy of loving the Declaration of Independence, promising that all men are created equal and endowed with freedoms, yet denying them. Denmark Vesey was also a religious man, and he believed that the Bible pretty explicitly rejected slavery. He's a member of the AME Church in Charleston, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Charleston had a fairly sizable free black population of 1,500 or so people. Now, historians, so Denmark Vesey was accused of starting a rebellion. Said that in the church, he was leading a rebellion for slaves to encourage them to rise up and either overthrow their masters or to escape them. Denmark Vesey was certainly an instigator. He was a rabble rouser that loved to piss people off, with righteous pissing off. There's not much evidence that he was actually organizing a rebellion. There is some actual counter evidence that says that the accused rebellion was cooked up by fearful slave owners. Denmark Vesey's case is kind of an odd one. He certainly did like being an agitator, but I don't think it's very clear that he was actually starting a rebellion. That might have just been a plot cooked up by people that didn't like it. Nevertheless, Denmark Vesey was accused, tried, and convicted of instigating a rebellion. He and 34 other people were hanged with flimsy evidence about instigating a slavery rebellion. Furthermore, the AME church where they had met, it was said that this was the hub of the rebellious plot. The city went and tore down the church and dismantled the AME as far as they could.
Does it still exist today?
Every Methodist Episcopal Church still exists today. I don't know about Vesey's congregation, if it still exists or not. I don't know that detail. The next rebellion, and this one's far more famous. Yeah.
Like, how do they seem like slave owners kind of knew what they were doing wrong but wouldn't admit it? Is that kind of like...
That's a real hard question to answer. I'm sorry, I'm going to dodge it because I don't have a good answer for you. I think that,
It's like,
okay, I'll try to flesh this out. And particularly in the Upper South, there is a feeling that slavery is bad, but inevitable. That it's like the thing that this is the way the system is, and we play in the system even if it's not perfect. That certainly isn't a universal belief, and in other parts, it's just outright like slavery is the right thing to do. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. It would depend on the person in the region. In the Upper South, it's more sympathetic to that view, though. Let's see, a far more famous and notable rebellion comes from a guy named Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave. He's not a free man. He's from Southampton County, Virginia. Turner was a religious mystic. Mystic is a person that believes that God is speaking straight to them, right? And so he's a religious mystic, and he believed that God had told him in particular to lead an uprising. He had a vision where he believed that Jesus told him that Jesus had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of man, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent, to fight against evil, right? The possession of the devil. For the time was fast approaching when the first would be last and the last should be first. So, Nat Turner feels like God is telling him that slavery is evil and you should go take it up you should take up the rebellion. In August of 1831, there was a solar eclipse, and Turner felt like that was the sign he was looking for. So he and a handful of others marched through Virginia, attacking white farm families, killing as many as 55 men, women, and children in the rebellion. Now, Turner believed that in the rebellion, hundreds of slaves would come rally to his side, that they would, leave their masters and join in the rebellion. About 80 actually did, not the hundreds, but about 80 actually did before the militia was called in and pretty handedly put down Turner's rebellion. Turner himself was captured and executed. And in what is usually the pattern, the counter-rebellion was set off, and the counter-rebellion killed 40 black people in 2 days. And some of it kind of gruesome, cutting their heads off and putting them on stakes around the town as a warning to others. Turner's Rebellion, Nat Turner's Rebellion, here's kind of like the billboard piece of it, was the last significant slave rebellion until the Civil War. Turner's Rebellion in 1831 was kind of the last time there was any significant rebellion. And it sent shockwaves through the South. Virginia legislature said, wait a minute, maybe we should be getting out of this business. I mean, people are getting killed over this. And Virginia debated a phase out of slavery, like what had been happening in the North. Maybe even encouraging a colony in Africa for former slaves. This was a side current that wouldn't go away in American politics for a long time, thinking that white and black people just clearly can't occupy the same country. We got to figure out how to just get black people out of here. And there's a back to Africa movement, and put slaves back in Africa. That was surprisingly pervasive, even amongst the people that you think are kind of enlightened on the race question. There's just a feeling that, man, we just can't have black people around. The prospect that planters would end slavery on their own, though, had passed. Virginia rejected this proposal, and it looked like looks like the South was kind of digging in their heels on this one. Virginia tightened its grip on slavery with new laws limiting slave rights. 1831, Turner's Rebellion was the turning point for the Old South. Basically, white Southerners closed ranks and said, slavery is the peculiar institution of the South and we'll defend it. 1831, the year of Turner's Rebellion. I don't think we can pin this on Turner, but it was that was the year.
There was a woman.
Is there somebody at the door?
Well, she looked in and I don't
Miss
know.
Morris was.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. She's probably looking took a attendance. And he's like, wait a minute, was TJ actually there? So, anyway, she does that sometimes. She double checks me. In 1839, I want to talk about this. This is a great story, and I don't think it's widely told enough. In 1839, there was a slave ship in the Caribbean flying under a Cuban flag, and it was trading slaves internationally. Now, most countries had treaties banning new slave importations, right? This was a violation of international law to continue to import slaves. But in 1839, there was a slave ship known as the Amistad, and it's a slave ship in the Caribbean, and there was a rebellion on the ship. And basically, the slaves that were being transported somehow broke their bonds and took over the ship. And they take the navigator and they are going to try to force him to sail back to Africa so they can go return home. It's unclear to me if the navigator said, okay, and then just pointed north, or if it was part of their negotiations or what it was. But rather than sailing back to Africa, the Amistad came up north and sailed into American waters, into U.S. waters. There it was intercepted by a U.S. ship who sees a foreign ship in American waters and wanted to go demand its papers. When that happened, President Martin Van Buren said, hey, this is a Cuban ship, this isn't our business. Point this thing back to Cuba and go sail back. But abolitionists said, no, this has now entered American waters, this is bringing slaves into America, and that's illegal. And these people need their freedom. So they actually were able to push this up into the Supreme Court of the United States and make a federal case out of it, the Amistad case. There's this great story that JQA, John Quincy Adams, former president, he's an attorney. The Adams family is a long line of abolitionists, take up the cause of the Amistad slaves and argues before the Supreme Court, arguing for their freedom. And John Quincy Adams is successful at it. The court agreed, saying that these international treaties are in violation of the slave trade, and these people need to be freed. The Supreme Court agreed. I think this is a fascinating decision to come out of this era where the Supreme Court is ruling this way. And the case might have inspired further uprisings. Like in 1841, there was a group of Virginia slaves who grab a ship called the Creole, and they sail it towards the Bahamas. Basically, they forced white navigators to sail them to the Bahamas, which was British territory, which at that point had banned slavery, and basically, instead of taking the Underground Railroad, took the overwater boat and sailed out. All right, that's a good place to stop our notes there. Get your composition books out. Open up to a new page and number it 1 through 10. We're going to do a low-stakes quiz.